Okay, part three. So we are going to be kind of switching gears and looking at the Pacific theater. So, like I said in the last part, the World War II was fought on these two fronts. We fought in Europe, fighting mostly the Germans, and then we also fought in the Pacific, fighting mostly the Japanese. So we talked about some of the challenges in the European theater, but the challenges in the Pacific were really different. So the first thing that we had to deal with was the distance, right? So not only was it a really big distance to get from the U.S. to where the fighting was happening, but there was also a lot of distance between, because if you look at this little picture here, we're fighting on all these little islands. So the distance to get between those was very difficult. Also in the Pacific, we're dealing with things like outdated equipment, shortages was a big deal. It was really, really difficult to resupply our troops because, again, mostly because of that distance. Also, we have a lack of infrastructure. So once we got to the islands, once we got on them, they didn't have, roads and bridges and things like that. So it was very difficult for us, to maneuver our tanks and whatever on these islands. Also, the climate, you've got a really hot, humid climate that a lot of people weren't used to. And then lastly, the culture, the language. So basically, you're landing on these little tropical islands. They have these indigenous people, this different culture. You've got this whole different language that we don't understand. And then you've got like the fact that the Japanese, they didn't just fight. Let me put it this way. They fought for honor. So they would not surrender. Like they were not about to give up or surrender because it was all about honor for them. And so we were not used to that. We were not used to an enemy that will not surrender, right? And so it was just a very, very different style of fighting. Really difficult to overcome. So, one of the things that we did to try to help with some of that was this idea of island hopping. So, that's the idea that we're going to go to one island at a time and we're going to take over that island and then go to the next one and take over it or whatever. And the idea here is that we're going to cut off Japan's supply lines. We're going to use those islands as like resupply bases for our troops, right? And so that was one thing that did help in the Pacific. So the big event that we talk about with the Pacific is the Battle of Midway. So this was the turning point in World War II. So basically, the U.S. learns that Japan's heading to Midway, the Midway Islands, with this huge naval force, the largest in history, right? And so the U.S. is able to find this out, and so we launch a counterattack, a surprise counterattack, and we're able to win. And so the Japanese never really recover in the Pacific after this, right? And this was a big morale boost for the US because this was like our revenge for Pearl Harbor, right? Like we get in there and we deliver this huge blow to their naval forces, and so that's kind of like our revenge. So then, if you remember, FDR died during his fourth term as president. So he got elected to 4 terms. This was before the 22nd Amendment, and he dies in his fourth term. And so Harry Truman, his vice president, becomes president. And when he becomes president, he learns that the U.S. has been developing a secret weapon. So you've got the Manhattan Project, is what they called it. It was in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and they had been developing the atomic bomb. So it was very secretive, super secretive. You can see this picture right here. This would have been on the base, like what you see here. Let it stay here. People were sworn to secrecy, right? Because we didn't want anyone else getting this technology. So Harry Truman comes in and he has to decide whether or not he's going to use this really intense, devastating weapon that no one's ever used before. He's got to decide if he's going to drop that bomb on Japan. So he determines that dropping the bomb is going to save more lives on both sides than invading Japan. So we had been fighting on these little islands, but we hadn't actually invaded the island of Japan yet. And he determined that if we did that, the casualties numbers were just going to be astronomical. So on August 6th of 1945, they dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. So that one was nicknamed Little Boy. And to just devastating effects. So we're going to look at some of the pictures in a minute. But then they went to Japan and said, okay, surrender And Japan says no, because remember, Japan fights for honor. They're not going to surrender. So on August 9th, 3 days later, we dropped the second bomb on Nagasaki. And that one was nicknamed Fat Man. So then we say, okay, Japan, surrender, or we're going to drop a third. So finally, on August 15th, Japan surrenders, and we call that Victory in Japan Day. And so that ends World War II. That is, the end of it, our fighting with Japan. So you can see in this picture here, I can't remember if this one is Hiroshima or Nagasaki. I can't remember. Anyway, so here's the before, right? Look at this river right here. You can see this river in the picture. Same river in the bottom picture. So this is ground zero. This is where the bomb would have been dropped. And it just like leveled everything, right? Like there's just nothing left. You can see some of the victims. So this was a lady who clearly had on like a plaid shirt, and you can see that it like burned the design into her skin. This little boy has radiation poisoning. So even after the bombs were dropped, even if you weren't in the immediate vicinity, you still had to deal with radiation poisoning. And then this is obviously like a man in a ladder, I guess, that got like vaporized. So here's some pictures from Victory in Japan Day. This is a very famous picture with the sailor and his lady there. So again, that ends World War II for us. And so we look at just a couple more things before we finish out World War II. We look at how did civilians in America support the war effort. So again, the U.S. is going to convert to a war economy, just like it did in World War I, but on an even bigger scale. So that idea that everything is going to the war effort. You've got a whole war production board that's going to oversee this and make sure that we're making enough and whatever. Created 7 million jobs in manufacturing, which ended the Great Depression. So even though we had the New Deal and we were trying these things to get rid of the Great Depression, it was still kind of lingering. This gets us out of it completely. So even though there's no really good to war, but it did get us out of Great Depression. And then obviously men were drafted into the military again. And so the government began rationing goods. If you did the activity with World War I, where you looked at the propaganda posters, you'll remember that a lot of them had to do with like trying to convince Americans to conserve their food, to not waste food, to grow their own food, that kind of thing. Well, in World War II, that became mandatory. So what they would do is you would have these little ration books or ration coupons, and you would get a certain amount of these scarce items for your family, depending on how big your family was. So things like meat, sugar, coffee, gasoline, etc. Those things you could only get a certain amount of. And then again, the women are going to go to work in the manufacturing jobs. Some even join the military. But the blacks were still being discriminated against, even in the defense industry. So they're saying, hey, we need help, we need people to work, but they were still discriminating against the blacks in these jobs, which brings us to our next thing. So we're looking at what executive orders did President Roosevelt use during World War II. So if you remember from government, an executive order is basically like a law that the president passes that doesn't have to go through the whole lawmaking process. So during World War II, you've got this guy right here, A. Philip Randolph, and he proposed a march on Washington, D.C. because, again, the blacks were being segregated in these defense industries and oftentimes weren't getting work, even though there was work to be had. So he was going to lead this huge protest, right? So Roosevelt meets with Randolph and he issues an executive order prohibiting discrimination in the defense industry, saying you can't do that anymore. You have to let the blacks and the whites work if it's for the defense industry. So the thing with this is it's going to be like our first little baby step towards ending segregation, right? So we're kind of looking in that direction, and we'll be talking more about that in the next unit. But this is like our first little teeny tiny baby step. And then another thing that Roosevelt did is basically, a lot of people were worried that these immigrant populations, Italians, Germans, Japanese, that lived in the United States, that they were a security risk, right? A lot of them believed that Pearl Harbor happened because Japanese Americans had been like secretly corresponding with the Japanese military, and that's why they were able to pull off Pearl Harbor. And so people were really scared that this was going to happen again. So Roosevelt issued an executive order to send all Americans of Japanese ancestry to relocation centers. That's what they called them, but they're really internment or prison camps. So really super interesting topic. If we were in class, we would talk about it a lot more, but it's just an interesting conversation because on the one hand, you've got, Roosevelt is trying to protect the country by not letting something like Pearl Harbor happen again. But on the other hand, like you can't really send an entire people group into a prison camp. So just super interesting topic. But again, we're not in class, so we don't get to talk about it. But anyways, so that wraps up World War II, and I'll be back.